In this video, I will be dissolving eggshells using vinegar and using what is left of the egg to model the diffusion of water. Eggs obviously have a hard outer shell, and the main component of that is what we call calcium carbonate, which is a base. If we add vinegar, which is acidic, to that base, it causes a chemical reaction, similar to baking soda volcanoes with vinegar, but not as intense. Because this is a chemical reaction, we don't end with the same chemicals that we started with. So the vinegar reacts with the calcium carbonate to make a different acid and water and carbon dioxide, which we see released as bubbles. In order to do the first part of this activity, all you have to do is put some eggs in a container and pour enough white vinegar over them to cover the egg. I initially picked out containers that were way too small, so I did have to pour the vinegar and the eggs into larger containers. This was after the egg had been sitting for a while, and you can see where the white shell had began to dissolve and the carbon dioxide bubbles. This is what the eggs looked like after sitting overnight and replacing the vinegar once. What we're left with now is a thin, squishy covering, and this is a membrane that, like our cells, lets water move in and out of it through a process called diffusion. In order to model diffusion, I took 2 of the eggs and put them into 2 separate containers, and I left the third egg out so that I would have something to compare them to later. For the first egg, I poured enough bottled water to just cover the egg. You could also use tap water, that would work just fine. And then for the second egg, I covered it with light corn syrup. Regular corn syrup would also work. The egg does float in the corn syrup, so I just covered as much of it as I could. And then I just let them sit in either the corn syrup or the water for a while. I ended up letting the egg sit overnight, and you can see this was the egg that sat out, and then the egg that soaked in water, and finally the egg that soaked in light corn syrup. And you can see that that one really changed its shape. If you look at all 3 of them next to each other, you can really see the difference, especially between the sizes of the egg that soaked in water, which is much larger than the egg that just sat out. So why does this happen? It's all about water concentrations. When there is more water or a higher concentration outside of the egg, like in the case of the egg that was soaking in literal water, it wants to balance it out. So, to get that balance, water has to move into the egg. When water moves into the egg, it has to take up more space, so the egg has to stretch out and it appears larger. In the case of the oil or syrup, there is a higher concentration of water inside the egg, and it wants to balance it out again. In order to do that, some of the water molecules have to move out of the egg, and that makes it get smaller, and it appears baggier and like there is less space being taken up. This process can be reversed though. So I took the egg that had originally soaked in corn syrup and I put it in the water. And I took the egg that had soaked in water and put it in the corn syrup. And I let them sit for a few hours. Even after just a few hours, the egg that had originally soaked in water was pretty much back to its original size. The egg that had originally soaked in corn syrup still had a little bit to go. You can see that it's still pretty squishy, not super firm. So I put it back in the water and let it sit for a little bit longer. And when I came back even a few hours later, it was pretty much to the same size.